Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, The Rise of the New Content Strategist, sponsored by Acquia. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Gegan. I'm the Content Studio Coordinator here at Digiday, and I'll be your host for today. In just a few minutes, we'll be joined by Amanda McCreary, who will be our moderator. She is the Senior Vertical Marketing Manager at Acquia. She'll also be joined by Rob Gill, who is the Vice President of Media Entertainment and Publishing at Acquia, where he partners with customers, vendors, and the Drupal community to push Acquia's services and platforms to meet the needs of a rapidly evolving digital media landscape. Prior to joining Acquia, Rob spent 8 years at NBC Universal, where he was the Vice President of Media Products. Rob is an advocate for open source frameworks and platforms powered by agile development methodologies. He's also a member of the Board of Directors for the Drupal Association. We'll also be joined by Jason Carmel, Global Senior Vice President of Marketing Sciences at Possible in Seattle. Jason manages a team of digital analysts, user researchers, and testing and targeting experts to support global client marketing initiatives with data-driven, actionable insights. He has more than 12 years of digital product and marketing experience and has worked with clients such as Nokia, Dell, and Janus to create digital experiences based on real-time feedback and behavioral data. Together, they'll guide us through the contemporary content marketing landscape and will lay out the many tools the modern content strategist needs to do their job well. A question and answer period will follow our presentation, so please stay through to the end. Feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar via our chat interface. At some point tomorrow, you'll receive an email with a recording of the webinar, as well as a link to download the slides from SlideShare, so be sure to keep an eye on your inboxes for that. And without further ado, let's get started. Amanda, take it away.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the introduction. So today we're here to talk about content strategy and content marketing. But first, let's take a quick look, take a step back, and we'll take a look and see how things have changed through the rise of digital. So content marketing is hardly new. John Deere has been doing it for over a century, and major household brands like Jell-O, Lego, Sherwin-Williams, and countless others have invested heavily in content marketing with the belief that it elevates the brand, connects with audiences, and ultimately drives revenue. As digital has evolved, so has content marketing. Whether they intended to or not, Blendtec was one of the early innovators, marketing on YouTube with their Will It Blend series. So who doesn't remember this video? When the first iPhone came out, Blendtec took advantage of the buzz and blended an iPhone. I'm sure there's not a single person on this webinar who wasn't shocked and amazed when this video came out, and it's a great early example of viral video. Today, innovative brands like Chipotle are going all in on content marketing. Jason will talk a little bit more about Chipotle later, but as I'm sure we all know, they are setting a new standard for content strategy and content marketing. They literally do it all. Recipes, social media, short-form video, long-form video, mobile games, and now, believe it or not, they've actually created a mini-series for Hulu called Farmed and Dangerous. Chipotle has a strong perspective, a rich story to tell, and the ability to disseminate all of this great content to their audience, wherever they may want to consume it. And by doing so, Chipotle has created an army of followers and advocates any brand would kill for. Recently, this loyalty and advocacy has become critical to the brand. As I'm sure you've heard, over the past few months, Chipotle has had a string of E. coli outbreaks at its restaurants. When they address the outbreaks on their Facebook page, a number of their advocates have come to their defense and are supporting Chipotle through this rough patch. Because of this extremely loyal fan base, it won't take long for Chipotle to be back on their feet and put profits back to normal. So how do you do it? How do you assemble a team that can develop story arcs and storylines, come up with marketing strategies to disseminate the stories, and manage all of mass content across many systems and technologies? We believe there is a third component to content strategy, the content architect. We all know the content strategist. They plan and manage the content itself. They may have a team of copywriters, video producers, or designers working under them, or they may be a one-man show doing all of the content creation themselves. Then there's the content marketer. They're the ones who make sure that the content created is relevant to the target audience, and they ensure that the right audience is getting the right content at the right time. The content architect is a new member of this larger content team. As digital has evolved, so has the technical ecosystem behind this content. Today's content team, meaning strategy, creators, editors, and marketers, are rarely located in one place working off of one system. Together, they create a mass amount of content and will keep that content in whichever system has been built for them or wherever is most convenient. On top of that, the content marketer is laser focused on delivering relevant, often personalized content to the right audience in the right location. Today, the content team needs someone to manage the technologies, systems, data, and all of the processes surrounding the distribution and maintenance of mass quantities of content. They need someone to ensure that editors and content managers have easy access to all of the content across an organization. And they need someone that can enable marketers to target the right audience with the right content across all of their digital properties. We're calling this person the content architect. Now, I know some of you are out there thinking, yeah, I'm a content strategist or I'm a content marketer and I do all of that. Do I really need another person on my team who can manage the technology side? Rob, Jason, what do you guys think?
So I'll jump in. This is Rob. I think, can one person do it all? I'm going to say, no, and that's because I look at myself primarily as a technology person, and I'm impressed with what content strategy and content marketing can do, and I'm not sure that I can do all of that. That said, I think it's also dependent on your organization. If you're a small, cable brand and you have a small team, everybody wears multiple hats. Whereas if you're, a large news organization or a big corporation, you probably have many people that wear multiple hats.
So this is Jason. Hey, thanks for having me. First of all, I agree, kind of. I think you can do it all, but you don't have to. And I think the difference there is subtle but profound. There are a lot of people, I think, who, again, as Rob said, depending on the organization, do all three. But I think the benefit of somebody who leads a content team is not in doing all three of these as kind of a subject matter expert. I look at it in an analogy, kind of like the creative director for an agency or brand. If you worked with a great creative director, you know what I'm talking about. The best creative director I have ever worked with, she's a writer. She started her job as a writer. She cut her teeth growing up through agencies, working for brands as a writer. And as she grew in experience, she was exposed to all of the other different aspects of creative, and began to both respect what they bring to the entire creative offering, and she became really, really good at synthesizing each aspect. So even though she is a writer and she can't Photoshop or video produce her way out of a paper bag, she doesn't have to. She's not a great creative director because she can design or video produce. She's a great creative director because she knows how everything works together, and how she can bring the right resources in to help. So I don't think the new content strategist has to be good at all of this, but I do think that just like the creative director, they really have to know enough about each to know when to bring in the right people. So it's a sort of cagey way of me hedging my bets and saying sort of.
Yeah, I'll actually agree with that. I think in my experience, some of the best brands and organizations I've worked with have had a leader that is, they don't necessarily have to be, like you said, a jack of all trades, do all this really well, but they're aware of it. And so, I've had brands I've worked with where it's a traditional creative director or traditional more business person who's very aware of the technology and actually engages with the technology and, has come to technology conferences and things like that. And that's where I see where there's a culture within those groups that content creation is much easier.
So that actually leads to a really great point and sort of a nice segue into our next topic here. So with all these people and all these teams from these various backgrounds creating all of this content, how do you manage all of it? How do you manage this massive library of content across multiple brands, multiple sites, and multiple teams within your organization?
Sure, so I think I can take that one. In my experience, it has primarily been at large media companies, and I think a lot of this still, even though I'm primarily going to use media examples, I think it applies across a lot of other verticals, and probably should ring familiar with a lot of folks. It's, as these organizations have grown, whether it's via acquisition or mergers, it grows via new channels that come around. It wasn't that long ago where the only thing you had to worry about was pushing out quote digital content to your website. Well, not that many years, 4 or 5 years ago, it was your website and it was quote mobile, and then it became your website, mobile, and tablet, and then in the last 4 years, that's just exploded exponentially. It's mobile's still a word that's used, but what does it even mean anymore? I mean, there's so many devices. There's always a new device coming out. There's always the new type of distribution channel, whether that's social, Facebooks, Twitters, Tumblrs of the world, or whether that's in the case of video over the top, so direct to consumer devices like a Samsung TV or an Xbox or a PlayStation. And all of that's happened in just the last couple of years. And when that started to happen, what tended to happen on the technology side was, well, we'll create a quick one-off solution to deal with this particular channel. That obviously doesn't scale. Unfortunate result of that approach is that many companies have lots of content locked into silos that don't, wherever that editor happened to create that content. If they created that content in the web CMS, then they probably have a pretty good search function and they can pull that content out. More than likely, they're in that editor is in a bit of a swivel chair, and they're also creating content in a video system, maybe Bright over the platform or something like that. They potentially have an e-commerce system like Magento or Hybris, and they're creating content just for that e-commerce platform. So that just keeps growing and growing and growing, and it's not getting any simpler. And that causes a couple specific problems. So next slide here. So one that's fairly obvious is content recreation, and you could argue maybe that's not such a bad thing. It's from a technology cost perspective. Storage is cheap. Maybe it's not a big deal, but I would argue from a productivity perspective, it's a pretty big deal. If you have multiple people in your organization recreating the same content over and over and over, especially if there's content that has to be approved, or in the case of, say, a broadcast company or a cable brand, they might have approved images that they can use for their cast, and if they're constantly having to pull that content or recreate that content, it creates a lot of work down the line. Also, I mentioned earlier, that content gets locked up. It gets stuck wherever it happened to be created. So next slide, Amanda. So this is just a quote that we pulled off of news text. So, and I think it's significant. So in 2013, content search costs companies over 14 grand per worker, nearly 500 hours per worker. Some of the bigger news organizations that we work with, they might have 20, 30, 40 editors working at any given time on the system, or if it's a major event like the Billboard Awards or the Grammys or the Olympics, or a major sports attraction or live event, that could even easily double, triple. That's a lot of content creation that's happening in a system, and and you multiply that out by that inefficiency, and it gets pretty expensive. So, how can you address this? What are ways you can manage across all of this content? So historically, that's been a kind of a big IT problem, and the IT approach has been solutions like DAMs or digital asset management systems, where let's build a giant monolithic system to get all of that content into one place physically, actually put all this content into a single data warehouse, or a single place where everybody can access it. I think the challenges with that is, as mentioned on the first slide, those channels, it's increasing exponentially, and there's always something new. It's gotten to the point now where, you can't plan a large IT enterprise system for every distribution channel, because you don't know what that next channel is going to be a year now or 2 years from now. So, how do you work around that? And I think one approach that we've seen work really well, and we've seen it work in smaller organizations, and we've seen bigger organizations also build this, and we've built a solution also, which is focus on the metadata, focus on empowering that editor in whatever their primary system happens to be. So if I'm a content creator, if I'm an editor for let's say, a large broadcast company, and my primary interface is, what would be considered my old, web CMS. If I have access to a system that brings all the metadata into one place, and specifically I say metadata because it's easy to move metadata around. It's hard to move assets around. So if we can bring all that metadata into one place, make it searchable, make it updatable, have the proper permissions tied to that metadata, that makes dealing with that content exponentially easier. And that's content, it's bidirectional. It's content coming in and it's content going out. You might have content coming in from, a third-party video system or Getty Images or, a news feed of some kind, or maybe stats if you're a sports organization, or financial information if you're, a news organization that's focused on finances. So that's all coming into one place, normalizing that metadata, making it easily accessible, easily searchable, and then making it accessible, being able to push that content out to wherever it might need to go. And so many companies are dealing with this right now in many, many different ways. Within broadcast, there's the whole concept of TV everywhere. So we're going to make sure that this piece of video content, long-form video content, you can access it from web, mobile, app, whatever it might be, and all the metadata around it. And being able to manage that in one central place definitely makes that easier. And then the last piece I would add to that is, it's funny how it's kind of come full circle. There's now historical things like billboards and out-of-home advertising that's been much more digital, and why not manage that in the same place? How's the content, the metadata around a piece of content different from something that's going to go to the web versus something that might go to a digitally controlled billboard?
So now that you've got all these great processes in place and you've got all this great access to the content with the metadata, what's next? How do you prioritize? How do you prioritize content types? How do you prioritize channels? And how do you do all of this based on your audience and your business goals?
So yeah, Rob mentioned billboards, and I think that's kind of a segue to an interesting story. I think the digital and the content strategist at some level inherited a weird legacy from offline advertising. We had an interesting challenge a few years ago where we were working with a client, and they said, "Hey, we have a billboard, and we need stuff in the billboard. Can you provide content for this billboard?" And it was a fun challenge. It was and an interesting one, and I think we're super proud of the work. But it was a weird way to approach content where you have channel first. We have a channel we have access to a channel, we have access to a magazine, we have access to a media spot. That's going to determine what kind of content we create. It is because we have this billboard that we're going to create this asset. It's because we have these ad placements that we're going to create this content. And if you think about what digital is supposed to be and what the content strategist is supposed to do, that's kind of goofy. The best way I've heard kind of this new content strategist mechanism to prioritize be described is actually from something that Coca Cola produced, and the video is actually available publicly. If you search for Google, if you search for Coca Cola and Liquid and Link, you can find this content. It's really interesting stuff to watch. But it's this idea of that in digital especially, distribution of content and technology, it sort of mandates this fluidity and a fluidity of everything about the content, both where it's placed, what it says, how it says it, and even who is saying it at the time. And what they say is that the content is liquid, but it has to be linked back to a main brand idea, this control over brand message. So we're letting go of a lot of the details of the content, and we're keeping very secure the main point, the brand message. So if you go to the next slide, what I think this means in terms of prioritization is that there are things in content creation that are liquid, and there are things that are not liquid, patently not liquid. So let's start with the not liquid stuff, because I think that's that's the most important. Business goals should never change, regardless of where you place your media. And business goals are what should determine the prioritization, not access to eyeballs, not access to channel, not access to influencers. It's what we think will move the business goals. Measurement criteria also should not change and should help determine the prioritization of where we go first. And measurement criteria, I think, needs to be just a side note on that, because it's a pet peeve. I think measurement criteria should be what you care about, what we care about, not what the tools tell us to care about. So a lot of times social media tools will spit out various metrics that we kind of canonize into something that's really meaningful, but we should throw that away. Well, not throw that away, but just not pay as much attention to that as the stuff that you are actively bonused on. The best thing that I've read recently about this is NPR, who you may not immediately assume is a bastion of digital measurement, actually decided that we're no longer going to measure our content based on page views. We're going to measure our content based on how much people care about the stuff that we make. And the way they do it, I think, is subject to some degree of debate, but the spirit behind that is fantastic. It is, here's what we care about. Whatever content we create, wherever it goes, whoever produces it, has to be measurable to that. That measurement criteria is not liquid. And then audience, I think, is not liquid, too. You have to decide, the content strategist, that is, have to decide who they're going after. And I think there's some fluidity in taking advantage of a found audience. Most of the time, you prioritize based on who you want to reach and why. The thing that is liquid, and I think that makes our jobs the most fun, is practically everything else. Channel, so whether something should live on Vine versus YouTube versus your own site. Tone, should it be funny, should it be emotional, should it be flat? Format, but even the producer, should this be something that we produce? Should we get a content partner to produce it, or should we let the world produce it? I think is a really interesting mechanism for liquid and linked. One of the things an example of liquid and linked, just to give you a sense of how I think it can play out. So this is some work that we did for Downey, and it involves this spot that they ran called "Rip Your Clothes On." This came out probably the end of probably about exactly a year ago, and it was timed to come out. It debuted at the Victoria's Secret fashion show on television. And what was fascinating about this spot, if you haven't seen it, you should go watch it. It's great. And they this couple starts almost completely undressed. And over some really kind of gentle background music, they put clothes on each other. And it's one of the most, and the idea is that Downey makes their clothes so soft that the sexiest thing that they can do is dress each other in those clothes. And it debuted, and the reaction was fantastic. And so the idea is we have this single piece of content that we planned with this brand spirit that we planned. Now, how do we be liquid? How do we take advantage of this in every other channel to see where it thrives and see where it doesn't? And for me, the idea of liquid blends really nicely into real-time marketing, which I think a lot of you are familiar with. And so that's what, in essence, we did, is we listened to the conversation in order to prioritize where to create content, how to create content, and who should create that content. So a lot of people were talking about the music that was playing in the background. It was an acoustic cover of a really cheesy 80s song. So there's content that you create to take advantage of that. There was a great Valentine's re-up of this campaign because it was so intimate and evocative that it just played well with that. And then there were natural, I think, more pronounced brand tie-ins of how to create these clothes and the spirit using Downey. What I want to accentuate here is that this idea of liquid, this real-time marketing, doesn't mean anarchy. Downey still had a very strong spirit of what it wanted to convey to its customers, and we were guided by that as we were creating this content. But we had complete fluidity in where and when, whether it was a Vine video or a Facebook post or a YouTube gig, whatever we wanted to do with respect to that, it was a question of taking advantage of that. So I think real-time marketing is a huge aspect of the new content strategist. Is something that I can't emphasize enough. There's a lot of good material out there on real-time marketing. There's a great book called Trendology by a guy named Chris Currens. You should pick that up and read it. It's a great intro into this stuff. But past that, I think that's really the mechanism for prioritization. It's having core content, core goals, and then taking advantage through experimentation and real-time marketing to get the most out of it.
Awesome, great. So one of the things that we wanted to address here, and we really can't talk about content marketing without really addressing the elephant in the room. Digiday has covered this extensively, as have many other publications that we all read on a daily basis, ad blocking. So I'm going to tee up a bit of a softball for you guys, but how can great content marketing solve this big ad blocking issue?
Yeah, I think that's the way, not to put too fine a point on it. As you said there, Amanda, there's a ton of great content on ad blocking and whether it means the death knell of advertising or if it's actually something that we can work around. I think most pragmatists, and I number myself among those, would take the latter view on that. This is really just the next step in evolution. I think last week, even Doc Searles wrote this great article for the MIT Technology Review about ad blocking, and he mentions sort of all the damning statistics that we're familiar with about how ad blocking is now present on roughly half the phones out there, and and traditional media companies are thinking, what are we going to do? Nobody's going to be able to look at our ads. I firmly believe that any industry that interrupts people will eventually see people unite to build technology against it. I mean, that just happens. That's why we have VHSs and VCRs and DVRs now. That's why we had Napster when we had Napster, which led into Spotify and all of those. I think trying to fight the technology is a losing battle. The way we fight is through great content. If you jump to the next slide, Amanda, in this article that Doc Searles wrote, he actually referenced his sister, who gets the Sunday paper every week. She's a Navy commander, former Navy commander, and when she gets the newspaper every week, before she even takes it inside the house, what he calls Fieldstrips it. And in essence, takes out every circular and every ad in the paper, throws it out before the thing even comes in the house. That is a very manual accounting of ad blocking. It's not new, and it's nothing that I think the new content strategist is particularly afraid of, because I think we understand intuitively that content that resonates is what is going to save the industry. And evolve it past ad blocking. I think content will always be greater than advertising. Our chief creative officer, a guy by the name of Daniel Chu, he's a perfect example of a creative officer. He dresses way better than I do, and he's very iconoclastic. Says these great, hard-hitting statements, and he's very poignant about saying the world doesn't need another ad agency. And what he means by that is not that we should all give up and go home, but that ad agencies, or the traditional idea of advertising, is on the way out, and that we should remember that it's our job to persuade rather than to bombard. And I think this scarecrow ad from Chipotle that you referenced earlier, Amanda, is a great example of how you can overcome sort of the menial ad blocking issue with just content that's fantastic. I'm sure most of you have seen this. I won't belabor what it is, but one thing that I think was fantastic is that this was originally not shown anywhere, not shown on TV. It was originally shown at the beginning of a movie in pre-roll in theaters, and Chipotle only decided to spread it out to other folks when the people who were attending the movie literally stood up and clapped at the content. I mean, this is a movie. It is movie quality, and as a result, it was viewed by millions of people. It won tons of awards, and it's still heralded, I think, as one of the greatest pieces of content digitally. If you go to the next slide, I think the awards are great, but what I think is most interesting about this is that this content didn't just persuade people to try Chipotle. It went further and actually changed behavior. One of the strategists that I work with sent me this image, and she's like, listen, you can show any amount of fancy food, photography, you can show any amount of best practices in organic farming, but when people see that cow in that box, it's going to change behavior. And it did. The best compliment I think this ad received was from a Washington Post editorial where the person writing it said, I think Chipotle went too far and accidentally created vegans. Which is fantastic if you think about it. They were so successful at changing behavior that they literally made people stop eating a certain type of food. It was an amazing way to influence and persuade. And then you think about that, and you're like, all right, well, maybe that didn't do so good for the Chipotle brand since they sell meat. But I think this great content still served them well, both in terms of building the advocacy that Amanda mentioned earlier, but also the quarter after this was produced, they saw a 15% rise in profits. So this kind of content is meaningful. It works, and it works way better than the ads that are currently being blocked by ad blocking. So I'm not that worried about it for that reason. The next slide is another example of great content, and I think this is interesting because there's an unspoken reality here that if you're going to do something that evolves past the norm, you need to be able to take some risks. So we did this work with Bacardi. It's for a brand of liqueur that they have called Germain, and the idea was to produce a series of peep shows through that keyhole on the left, where Hannah Simone, the actress from The New Girl, would sort of, to the sounds of Belle Epoque French music, she would, it wasn't quite burlesque, but it was very risque. She was dressed scantily. She would move and address the camera evocatively. And it was the idea was to celebrate this idea of vive the day life. It's an idea of where, and the idea was actually to attract a decidedly female target. And this was risky for two reasons, I think. The first is that this was launched entirely on Periscope, and it was the first brand play on Periscope. So without a great deal of knowledge of how that channel was going to react, all we knew was that that channel had people that matched the target that we were really interested in, and that Bacardi was. The other thing that I think was especially risky about this was the content. It was risque, literally risky. And the idea of this, it was filmed by a female director. It was created by an entirely female creative team. And the idea was to do this as not as something pornographic, but as evocative as and mature and empowering. And the millions of people saw this. And what was fascinating about this is that this wasn't an ad that was placed interrupting people. People had to actually find this. So I think the key difference there is people were so interested in this that they left what they were doing in order to find this content, which they perceived as better. I think we were blown away by how the people reacted to this. It was phenomenally successful in terms of goals of brand awareness, reach, and product sentiment. And what is even more fascinating about this is I think when you look at this, okay, you have an A-list director, you have a famous actress, you have a production set and a film crew. This was probably super expensive. But when you map the expense relative to how many people saw this and what they did with it, it was no more expensive than the traditional ad buy. So I don't think that risk involves more cost. I just think it involves the spirit of innovation that the new content strategist really embodies.
So I think as content strategies and content marketers, like I personally was really excited to hear your stat on Chipotle and how they performed after the scarecrow. I hadn't heard that before. I think we all fundamentally believe that great content resonates, and everything that you just said, that it changes behavior, it leads to loyalty, and at the end of the day, like, it really helps to move your company and your product forward. But, and this is a million-dollar question, how do you prove it? How do you measure the ROI of content marketing?
So there's a lot of ways. I think I'd start with how do you know who's viewing your content through these different digital channels and how they're interacting with that content. Again, it's much like the content management systems and dealing with the fractured content silos. It's still pretty immature. It's being defined within the industry as we work in it. The couple points I'd like to try to make. The first one is, there's a lot of systems out there that will collect data about your users and they'll sell it back to you as third-party data. But most of the systems are mature enough these days that you can collect that data yourself and you can own that data, and that's the first-party data side. What are the advantages of owning that first-party data? They're huge. I think you can own your customer. You can own that customer user profile. And some examples are on the next slide are how, if that user is known, that's a huge advantage, obviously. So if they've identified themselves via their email or via a user, they've logged in some way, you can very easily collect that data across systems. And if those are your own internal systems, it makes it a lot easier to connect that data. So, have they purchased things from you? Just about every, not just in media, but just about every vertical out there has, email lists and distribution ledgers and things like that. Can you use that data? Can you connect that data? Yeah, you can. You can connect it to that profile. How did they behave on your site? On your mobile device, on your iPad, on those different channels. What did they click on? What were they viewing on the page? All that can be measured now, and that's. Seems obvious, but it's only new within the last couple of years. And then being able to connect that data on the back end with other third-party customer data. So over on the right, just a couple of quick examples, but and there's some that aren't even on there. So Omniture data or Google Analytics data, Blue Kai, all that third-party data is collected. You can own the customer profile and then use that third-party data to just make that customer profile even deeper. What can you then use that customer profile for? So, there's a lot of ways to use it. I think on the advertising side, and this I think ties directly to the conversation we just had with Jason around ad blocking and how to get around ad blocking via good content. Is we're in a world today where we know so much more about that individual user that's interacting with you digitally than we would ever know about the person, via radio or via broadcast or via TV, but we haven't seen the true value of that yet. And the reason is because it started with lowest common denominator, right? It started with cheap ads, just blasted out, banner ads to every single person who went to a page, whether it was relevant or not. Now that we have these customer profiles, and now that if you have that customer profile and you own it yourself as first-party data, you can really leverage that data to have better advertising. On the next slide, just a couple more places where you can make those connections. So, social, there's a lot of debate. How do you measure success on social media? Does the number of Twitter follows you have, really matter? Is that the number of likes that something gets on Facebook? Is that something that's, how does that actually apply to whether your content's successful or not? I think, again, if you own that data yourself and you can make those connections, I think it's a lot more relevant. On the next slide, once you have that user customer profile, one major challenge is, what if you don't know who that user is? What if that person isn't logged in? And this is where, with anonymous, you can gather so much anonymous data around how somebody's interacting with your site, and connect that with other data that you can get a pretty long ways down to knowing the things that matter most about that user target and that target audience. And once you have that data, I think you can do some really cool things to help with your content marketing. I think Jason's going to get some examples there.
Thanks, Rob. I think when we talk about ROI of content itself, there's been a shift. And what we're really talking about at the end of the day, when we're talking about ROI specifically, is attribution shift. And I think the content strategist has to look at three things. So there's channel optimization. There is, which is, all right, I'm pushing this content out. Where is it doing the most, giving me the most value? There's also, I think, historically, at least and over the past 10 years, it's been pushing back on this idea of last click. So even though somebody saw something that was the straw that broke the camel's back and convinced them to go buy something, there were a lot of other touch points beforehand, and we'd be idiots to disregard those in favor of just whatever the last thing was. And I think we've made some pretty good strides on that, and the content strategist has been essential in that, since a lot of content strategy is upper funnel stuff, and we've seen that when you turn off the upper funnel stuff, the lower funnel stuff suffers pretty remarkably. And I think the content strategist has also been very interested in online to offline, and this is obviously connected to digital, but the idea of digital content for stuff that you buy offline has an impact, whether you were talking about cars or a fabric softener. When you see content digitally, it does impact your decision making when you are not in front of your second screen or your computer. So how do you take credit for that in the right ways at the right aspect ratio? So this is something that content strategists have been dealing with since the dawn of digital, and they still have to do it. We're still dealing with this now. This has not gone away. What I think the new content strategist has to deal with is something a little bit more nuanced. Which is, with all of this content that we're creating, what was it specifically about this piece of content that made it ZING? ZING is a technical term. So how do we know that this particular video or this particular image or this particular piece of music was that the deciding factor that made people decide to do something? And being able to do that is, I think, within the province of this new content strategist. If you go to the next slide, I think the summary is new content strategists use analytics and attribution not just to calculate ROI, but to actively make the creative better. You can't not calculate ROI, but I think the new content strategists are now super interested in using the data that we get back in order for them to improve at their jobs. I work with great content strategists here, and they are just hungry for data. As soon as we release something, it's not a question of, well, all right, it's not as blunt a question as did it work or not, but it is what is about that piece of content that did work or didn't work, so that the next time we do this, we either take advantage of it or don't make the same mistake again. I think that type of inquisitiveness and that not fear of data, but quest for data is a hallmark of the new content strategist. A great example of this, I think, is some work that we've done for Skype. And so we've been helping Skype on their social on some of their social content, and Skype itself is a social platform if you think about it. And they are, and all the people who use Skype are very, I think, very open to participate in social, and as a result, we've been called to increase production on how much content to throw out there, which is great, but it also sort of begs the question of, all right, with all of this creative that we're producing, how do we know which particular aspects of which particular things work? You don't want to take a great creative and throw the baby out with the bathwater because one thing was tone deaf. Is there a way that we can use data to help our content strategy team get smarter and know what specific elements of a piece of creative work? And I think that attribution is really interesting. The way we approached the problem was through theft. Well, not theft. We read, there's a really interesting math paper that was produced by a Swiss mathematician a couple of years ago. Amanda, if you go to the next slide, and that is, what he did was he wrote kind of a model about Kickstarter, and he scraped every piece of data about Kickstarter and all the projects that were successful or not successful. He looked at three things. He looked at the momentum, how fast people's donations happened. He looked at the creator network. Then he looked at how people shared about the Kickstarter that was up for grabs. And he was able to create this model that would predict the success or failure likelihood of a particular project within 4 hours of it being launched. And the math we thought was super interesting, and we're thinking to ourselves, if you can predict success or failure of a Kickstarter project in 4 hours, the first 4 hours of a 30-day project, is there a way we could take this thinking and apply it to advertising and say, all right, what are the aspects that have the most likelihood, the most influence in making a piece of creative successful? And so that's what we did. We looked at that methodology, and we created our own, I guess, model for how to do this. Apologies for the awful smart art, but the idea here is that you create content, and then you create this taxonomy about the content. So you come up with and the taxonomy is nothing more elaborate than a list of characteristics about a piece of creative. This piece of creative was a short-form video. It had non-human actors in it. It was funny. It did not mention the brand very much. It was targeted towards this audience, and it was launched on this channel, and it had music. And you come up with a list of a couple of dozen of these characteristics for every piece of creative that you send out there. And then what we did was we sent it out there, and we measured each one according to 4 aspects: how far it reached, what the engagement was, how much it was amplified after the reach, and then a qualitative aspect of what did people think about it and how did it change their understanding of the client, of Skype. And then we weight and convert that into a score that gives us insight into the value and volume of each piece of creative. And what we can do then is plot our creative on this really simple 2x2, which is on the bottom is volume, and then compared to value. And what we're looking to do, obviously, high-value things that have a lot of volume are great. Low-volume things that have low value are awful, and you want to kill those. And you plot each piece of creative on this grid, and it tells you very specifically what the content strategist should do with it. So if you go to the next slide, you can see a little bit of how we would apply this. So you see there's a short-form video with sock puppets, and it is low volume, so not a lot of people saw it, but it was really high value. So for whatever reason, the people who did see this really got Skype much better than those who didn't. So for that, the new content strategist would look at this data and say, all right, something like that, and things like that in the future, we need to make sure that there's a media spend behind it so that more people will see it. It's doing great work. Now we just need eyeballs so that people can get more access to it. We look at something like the Harry Potter emoticon in the upper right, where lots of people saw it, and when they saw it, they immediately did things in Skype that were more valuable to the client. Well, for things like that, you want to scale it. You want to do the feedback to the content strategy team is more stuff like this, please. This is great. This really resonates. with the client base, and it makes them change behavior in a way that's beneficial to the client. And then every now and again, you get something like the animated illustrated monster in the lower right, where something is super popular and fun and people love to share it, but it doesn't really impact how they think about the brand. And we've all had pieces of content like that before, sort of fun things that don't actually move the needle. And those aren't horrible. We just need to change those so that maybe the next time we do it, there's something that's a little more focused that ties in with the brand so it adds more value. So this ends up being a nice blueprint for our content strategy team to take and create new content after that. And then we can take this and abstract it out of the actual creative and start talking about themes, where we know that animated GIFs are really popular, but we have to, when we create them, we have to work pretty hard to make sure that they're tied to the business goals. Short-form video is always very valuable, but whenever we launch short-form video, we have to make sure that we put some sort of media spend behind it. And anything with heavy brand probably isn't going to work that much. So this becomes a blueprint for our creative team, for our content creation team, to get better at their jobs. What I think is great about this is that this changes data to focus not just on attribution and not just on how much money did it make, but it makes the organization smarter. It makes the brand team smarter. It makes the agency smarter, so that over time you get a really good sense of the evolution of what works and what doesn't. I think what differentiates new content strategists from content marketers in the past is this idea that this is a long game. This evolves over time. And the more you can pay attention to data longitudinally, the better you'll be.
Great. So we're about out of time. I know we're running a little low. So I just want to thank Rob and Jason. The insights that you guys have shared and the stories that you've told have been fantastic. They've been really, really interesting for me as a marketer, and I'm hopeful that they're interesting and valuable to everyone else on this webinar. As we wrap up, I want to make sure that we sort of collect the key takeaways and sort of collect, really who is a new content strategist and what makes up this new person and sort of this new persona. So first and foremost, the new content strategist is integrated. Stories, mediums, channels, audiences, they're all critical to a successful content strategy, and not just sort of a component or an element within your team. They also understand the integration of that team, whether it's a commerce team who sits over here, a brand team that sits in a different office, or regional teams that sit throughout the world. All of this integration across content, audiences, and teams is critical for both external success as well as to ensure internal efficiencies and making sure that all that content is pushed to all the right places. And then technical. So we talked a little bit about the content architect, and whether this is a unique individual within your organization or just an element of your existing team with different people owning sort of different portions of that, this person understands the technology, systems, data, and processes. They understand that those are all a key component to enabling the content creators, enabling the editors, and enabling the marketers to all execute on sort of their day-to-day and their individual strategies within the larger content strategy. Jason talked a lot about liquid content, which I thought was a really fascinating concept, and I think it's really interesting. I think the new content strategist really gets that, and they really encourage the content that they create to be very liquid and to sort of be part of that model and be real-time marketing. But they also understand the need to still maintain control over the brand message and the business goals. The new content strategist embraces ad blocking. We hear so much these days about how ad blocking is really harmful to the industry, and people are really struggling to figure out how to deal with this ad blocking problem. But the new content strategist actually sees it as a great thing, not as something to fight. The rise of ad blocking technology means that content strategists and marketers really need to step it up. They really need to deliver highly valued content that resonates with their audience, and this content that people will seek out and find and want to consume. And for marketers and content strategists, frankly, that's the fun part. That's what makes our job really fun, not churning out ads with animated GIFs just to get people to click on. And then finally, the new content strategist is very analytical, and I think Rob and Jason both had some really, really great points around that. You know, the way Jason said that the new content strategist is looking at the long game. I absolutely believe that's true. They're constantly looking to analytics to confirm, craft, and redefine their content strategies, and to really understand what makes content zing. Not just to simply calculate an ROI, not to just look at page views, but to really understand fundamentally what works, what doesn't, and how to continually improve their content over the long haul. So I just want to thank everyone who attended. I know this is a bit of a tough time of year, and we really appreciate you taking the time to attend today. And I understand we have just a couple of minutes, so I'm going to turn it back over to Joe to open up for any questions from the audience. Joe, are you there? Did we lose our Digiday representation?
Hey guys, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes, there you are.
Hey, sorry about that. So we have just a few minutes for questions. Let's take one that just came in here. It says, what tools do you use to know what's trending to support content creation?
I think there are a lot of great tools that you can look at for trending that run the gambit from free to more enterprise stuff. I mean, we're relatively tool agnostic when it comes to that. I think now that traditional search engines are even bringing in more social trend topics now, and the tools themselves will provide some degree of searchability and trends. So specifically, as it relates to that, with respect to actually getting more of a zeitgeist of the web and figuring out what particular people are talking about. I mean, I think Spreadfast is fantastic. We've used other more traditional social listening tools as well, anywhere from Crimson Hexagon to Visible Technology. So I think the tool sets out there are. I mean, by the time we're done with this call, there will probably be 3 new tools that allow you to listen to social trends. So I think taking a look at them and figuring out what your specific goals are, how real-time you need your real-time data will be a good indicator of what you should be using in order to figure out how people are talking about your brand. That's my sense.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is there's a lot of, so for example with Drupal, which is open source, there's a lot of great connections that exist where you can actually view that data in real time within your CMS. You mentioned Spreadfast, they have a great API that can be integrated directly into Drupal. And what I like about that approach is that the editor is able to see how their content's performing directly into the system that they're creating that content in. So if you have an article, that's trending based on a certain title name, you can do an A/B test and say, all right, this particular title tends to resonate more, this particular image, let's push that, and that integrates also directly with a lot of our products.
Great answer. Thank you, guys. We have another question here. Someone would like to know, how do you weight the 4 areas of distribution to create a score that tells you how valuable and useful the content is to the brand?
That's a great question. I was told I would only be asked easy questions. I'm no kidding. What is tricky about that is that the 4 things that we measure are entirely dependent on the goal of the particular creative. So there's some content that is more dedicated towards upper funnel, and some that is more dedicated towards lower funnel. And so we actually weight those those bubbles in that slide that I showed are actually different sized for different clients, and sometimes different sized for different pieces of creative itself. So they're shown equally there, but they very rarely are weighted equally. So it's a great question. Thank you for asking that.
Great, thank you very much. And I think we have time for one more. Megan would like to know if you have any other potential solutions related to managing your large content library internally beyond just meta tagging the data.
So, there's a lot of approaches to that. I think the one that I focused on is a product we have called Content Hub, which aggregates that metadata content outside of Drupal. But there's also within your content management itself. So if you're using, for example, Drupal, that can be your source for content. I think the challenge there is that you're taking extra steps to bring in content from third parties into one system, and then you run into the longer term challenge of what is that next channel going to be. That said, it seems like the technology space, especially in this industry, is shifting so quickly that I feel like everybody tends to re-platform every 2 or 3 years regardless. So if you have a certain set number of channels or a certain set number of incoming content that you can focus on over 2 or 3 years, that's definitely something you can build directly into your CMS so that the editor has direct access to that content.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much. Thank you to Rob and Jason and Amanda, and of course to our sponsor Acquia. And thank you all for attending the Rise of the New Content Strategist. As a reminder, you'll all have a link to this recorded webinar within your inboxes tomorrow, as well as a link to the slide share, so you'll be able to download the slides and take a look if you need to remember anything or want to reassess or take a look at that great chart of the 4 most important indicators for determining that score for your content. I think that will do it for us today. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.